Dr. Francis McKilkenny is been in Boise for quite a few years here and been working on restoration. And he brings a lot of new tools with him and a little different background than some of the old crowd that was at the station. And I think you'll enjoy hearing his perspectives and kind of some of the advances that are being made in restoration. And he's kind of interested in the big picture, what's really happened, what really works, and really a good eye to the germplasm or the genetic background of things and what that might entail in the future. So with that short introduction, let's get started. So take it away, Francis.
Sorry, I was muted. Just wanted to make sure that everyone can see my slides here. All right, since no one objected,
Yes, we can see them, Francis. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to be talking about restoration plant material development in the Great Basin region of the United States. This is kind of a history and a comparison of research approaches. It also kind of get into philosophy a little bit, which I'm going to start out with right away. So let's see. All right. So these are some giants of philosophy, the philosophy of science in the 20th century. Karl Popper came out with his book, The Logic of, I think it was The Logic of Science, Scientific Discovery or something like that. It's in German here, so I can't remember the exact title, but he's kind of your classic, what most people think of science as, which is that science proceeds by falsifying theories and hypotheses. So science, his view was that science is objective, it's rational, and that, the reason why a theory or a hypothesis stands is because it stood a bunch of tests over time. However, a few other folks started to kind of question this. Now, with Karl Popper's view, I think this is kind of this, like I said, it's the standard base view that most people have. That's what you're taught in most science classes, that kind of thing. So it is still the dominant view that most people hold about science. But this started to be questioned in the latter part of the 20th century, first by Thomas Kuhn. And he's the one who has, if you've ever heard of the idea of a paradigm shift, that's where it comes from, is Thomas Kuhn. And he basically talked about scientific paradigms defining the questions that can actually be asked. And that science proceeds by these paradigm shifts. Kind of the point is that science is partly objective, but it's constrained by available theory and methods. And so, those things that have already been done and the way thought has proceeded in science can affect how science moves forward. And oftentimes there needs to be a big shift in order to get to the next stage of understanding. There's a lot of details in this, but and then lastly, Paul Fairvend, he kind of took Kuhn and ran with it, so to speak, and really talked about science being, he actually wrote a book called Against Method, of all things, and pointed out that science is idiosyncratic and it proceeds through many avenues, including cultural and political avenues. Pointing out that science is partly subjective, where logic and rationality sort of change depending on the interactions between many of these factors. And so, you know, kind of like what I like to think about in this case and how it might apply to what I'll be talking about are conservation goals. How, say, for example, land management agencies think about these things and what kind of research gets done because of that will be really important in this talk. So with that in mind, I think that's the framework to think about this, that there's a philosophical background that I'd like you to sort of consider as we go through the talk. Just want to introduce the Great Basin. We are in the Great Basin region, or the Great Basin Desert. There's kind of the ecological reach of the Great Basin, which is what I'm defining it as here. And then there's kind of physiographic definitions. The physiographic definition is the smallest, where you have topography that creates these large basins, and that's more in the southern half of this area. Great Salt Lake, for example, and it holds the water. Whereas here in the Snake River Plain, we do have the watershed does drain into the Columbia and then the ocean through the Snake River. But in general, there's a pretty cohesive ecosystem throughout this area. It's fairly large, 550,000 square kilometers. 75% of this is controlled by the federal government. So the decisions that are made by federal agencies have a very significant effect on how land management works in this region. It's very topographically variable. Most of it is part of in fact, pretty much all of it is part of the Basin and Range Geologic Province, which is, I recently learned, basically an area where North America is kind of stretching and tearing apart. And a lot of the portions of the area have dropped down into basins, and what remains are the ranges. There's a lot of range in aridity and moisture, ranges from salt desert to montane forest. So quite a bit of range in precipitation. This area has had a number of impacts, and there are a lot of environmental challenges. Early in the 20th century, there was a significant increase in the amount of grazing that occurred throughout the Great Basin. So a lot of that was initially sheep and goats, although the amount of sheep and goats that are grazed has significantly changed and dropped quite a bit since its peak in the early part of the 20th century. Grazing with cattle and horses has been fairly stable, although it also peaked in 1920 and has declined somewhat over the last century. So a lot of what we have left in grazing are primarily cattle, and the reason why they're put together here are cattle and horses and sheep and goats is that's how the statistics are tracked. And so I assume most of it is cattle and cattle and horses, for example, and probably most of it is sheep and the sheep and goats, but that's not always, I don't know that particularly. So the point being that there's been a huge impact of grazing on this region, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, and diminishing to some degree, but there's been for the most part, it's been a sustained impact. There's also been a significant invasion by Bromus tectorum, cheatgrass. It was initially seen in this region in Provo, Utah in 1894. Then it was found in Elko, Nevada in 1905, Reno, Nevada in 1906. It had, by the 1930s, it had actually pretty much invaded every county in the region, but it has continued to increase in abundance and elevational range. So this is, I took a bunch of data, and I would say there's a little bit of hand waviness here because I'm, putting data from a lot of different publications into this. But in general, what we find is when, if you look at older studies that were looking at cover of cheatgrass in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, you see a lot less cover. Whereas as you come forward in time into the 90s and 2000s, some of these studies have quite a bit of cover of cheatgrass, up to 35, 40% in some cases. And we also know of areas in around the Great Basin, like northern Nevada, where there are probably covers of up to 80, 90% in some cases. So there is evidence that it's been becoming more of a problem and taking over more of the plant communities than it did in the past. So the other big issue in the Great Basin is fire. These are all the fire, basically all the areas that have burned in the Great Basin since 2000. So you can see a significant area has burned. These are all primarily rangeland fires, and it's quite a bit area. So the fire has a significant effect. If you look at the U.S. trend, this is kind of all of U.S. wildfires. That includes forest fires. You can see a pretty significant increase in amount of fire. In the Great Basin, we have it's a little bit harder to pull the data out, but the trends, at least since the early 2000s, there's been quite a bit of fire. There was less fire prior to that. I don't have those data to show, but in Nevada, they did calculate Nevada rangeland fire trends, and it's almost doubled the amount of area burned between 1980 and 2020. So significant amount of change in fire. One thing to be aware of, though, is that a lot of this fire is fairly concentrated, more so than the larger map might show. And so these are here in these red circles, for example, you can see areas that have burned over and over again. The blue area are areas where there's only been one fire. So a significant portion of a lot of that area that's burned has burned once in the last 20 years. And so only a few places are actually burning over and over again. These areas do tend to be heavily invaded by cheatgrass. They tend to be lower elevation. And this is where a lot of seeding goes on. Another big issue in the Great Basin is the greater sage grouse. Sage grouse has declined significantly since the 1960s, and probably even over the whole 20th century. This is kind of just where we have a lot of data, and so estimates have been able to be made. Sage grouse is kind of an important indicator species. It is dependent on sagebrush and also plant community diversity. Sage grouse chick rearing requires some sort of structure for the chicks to be protected from predators, aerial predators. And then in terms of rearing the chicks themselves, they need a lot of protein, they need a lot of food, and a lot of times how they get that is by eating arthropods and forbs. And so the more forbs you have, the higher diversity of forbs, there's a correlation between that and the arthropod community. And so these chicks are basically dependent to some degree on having a high diversity plant community. All right, so there's all of these issues. Restoration and seeding in particular post-fire seeding or seeding of various kinds using plants to restore vegetation, to restore plant communities has actually been practiced in the Great Basin for quite a long time. Some of the early seedings were in the 1920s, 30s, and that sort of picked up over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st. So it's very interesting what has happened in terms of research, and I'm going to focus on two federal research programs here to kind of give an idea of how research into plant material development has occurred in order to support restoration in the Great Basin. I should also point out that these research programs have a lot of, so while there are other groups that have done research, there is a level of dominance that these research programs have shown, in the sense that they've done a lot of the research that has gone on, a significant portion of it. But I do want to make sure that it's understood that these are not the only things going on, that there are other groups that have done a lot of work as well. So I'm going to focus, I think, first on this upper branch here, which is so both of these are within the USDA. Let's put it that way. So in pre-1900, the USDA had a division of agrostology and a division of botany. And in 1901, that was joined together into the Bureau of Plant Industry. And you'll find a lot of the work started, the USDA grounds. There are some ag experiment stations in Washington, D.C. That's kind of how a lot of this started. And this was focused primarily on various types of agricultural research and use of plants in industries. And so there began to be this focus on forage species, particularly in agricultural settings. But for a while, it was actually, they were actually doing work on grazing in wildlands. So there was grazing research that was actually going on in the early part of the 20th century. That ended up getting transferred to the U.S. Forest Service Office of Grazing Studies, which looked at the impacts of grazing. So looking at the impacts of grazing was actually removed from the Bureau of Plant Industry. But the BPI continued to do research that was focused on forage species, including species that could be used in wildlands or in areas, rangelands, that private or public lands where range improvement might be desired. So that sort of proceeded, and eventually the Bureau of Plant Industry was turned into the Agricultural Research Service. So what we know today as the Agricultural Research Service used to be the Bureau of Plant Industry. And at that time, it actually took on some of the research that was being done in the U.S. Forest Service. So in 1915, you had grazing research, the impacts of grazing research that had been transferred to the Forest Service. That remained in the Forest Service, but the Forest Service had done a lot of work on plant material development, and all that grass and forb research in 1953 was transferred to the Agricultural Research Service when the Agricultural Research Service was formed. However, a lot of that research was kind of left by the wayside. So a lot of the work that had been done with the Forest Service as it was transferred over didn't really get continued. And a lot of the research that the Agricultural Research Service was doing in this region continued to focus on introduced plant grass species primarily, because those were the species that were forage species, that were some of the best forage species in terms of what they were defining as good. And in fact, there developed an attitude in some of the the labs in ARS, the Forage and Range Lab in particular, that native plant species did not work for use in these rangelands for revegetation purposes. And there was actually someone wrote an article called The New Range War, and quoted Jerry Chatterton, the head of research at the Agricultural Research Service Forage and Range Lab in 1992. And he said, millions of dollars are wasted every year in attempts to reestablish native plants. For years, I've asked to see a successful planting of native plants on more than 1 acre or 2 of rangeland. There aren't any. So he believed that native plants did not work, was willing to state this opinion in a published article. And so when we hear things like natives don't work, which you might hear sometimes among some of the agencies, this might be where that initial idea comes from. Now, I would point out that in 1992 or the early 90s, the ARS Forage and Range Lab actually hired some scientists to start working on native species. And the Forage and Range Lab does indeed still work on native species, but that really didn't start until the 1990s. So even though there was the idea that at that lab that, or at least the head of the lab thought natives didn't work, the lab did actually start to work on native plant materials at that time. One thing that's interesting is that up until the early 90s, there was a 9-to-1 ratio of non-native to native plantings. And so essentially, well, and I shouldn't say plantings, but use of non-native to native species. So in restorations in the Great Basin, or revegetations, I should probably call them, the primary plants that were used were non-native grasses. So kind of interesting there that someone was saying natives don't work, and yet maybe they weren't actually being used. So let's see, I'm going to back up a little bit and go into the history of the Forest Service research program. So this program, it kind of formed out of several different Forest Service programs. There was, in 1905, Forest Service Research and Development began. And so that's actually the branch of the Forest Service that I'm in. I'm a research biologist with the Forest Service Research and Development branch. In 1910, again, the U.S. Forest Service Office of Grazing Studies took on grazing research, and particularly looking at the impacts of, the impacts of grazing research. And it took on, in 1915, took on that research from BPI. The Utah Experiment Station, which was part of, let's see, I think it was the Uintah National Forest at the time, began in 1912. In 1926, the Office of Grazing Studies joined into the Research and Development branch of the Forest Service. And then in 1928, all the various experiment stations, including the Utah Experiment Station, were all consolidated into Forest Service R&D. And so, so there's some confusion in terminology, but these days, the way stations are kind of larger entities, and a lot of these places like the Utah Experiment Station, while they still exist, they're not necessarily called stations any longer. In any case, in that, the Utah Experiment Station continued to be used, and at that time, the R&D in that region, which was the Intermountain region at the time, started to focus on native plant species. Basically, the reason for this is that they were looking at these impacts of grazing and were trying to find ways to mitigate those impacts and recover areas from grazing. Particularly, with the idea more of restoration than with range improvement. So here, in some sense, the philosophy is different. With ARS, they were trying to maximize forage for grazing purposes. And in the Forest Service, they were trying to recover areas from grazing impacts. And so there was actually a significant period of research that was done from the mid 1920s until 1953. And a lot of that research, I mean, there was a lot done. Unfortunately, when it got transferred, a lot of those projects basically got canceled. And we don't have a lot of information remaining from those days. We have some research papers, some data, but a lot of the plant materials that may have been developed out of that time are all gone. And so that shift, which was, made a decision made at the departmental level to shift that research program over to ARS, had an effect on the science that was being done. So if we kind of think about what Fairbairn's criticism was of science, is that culture and politics can affect how science actually gets done. And I think this is a very interesting example of that. So all of the research on grass and forb species was transferred to ARS, and the R&D program in the Intermountain station was then focused on native shrubs or trees. And so that's when the shrub lab started in Provo, Utah. Now, over time, the Provo lab and the Intermountain Research Station, which ended up forming into the Rocky Mountain Research Station, which I'm part of, there was a switch over time into more development of native grasses and forbs. So even though there was a period of time where everything was focused on forbs, in the 1980s and 90s, you start to see an increase in actually looking at these other species. So, what it really did, the function wasn't necessarily that people stopped looking at these things in various research programs, but that a significant portion of research that had been in the Forest Service was essentially canceled. Also want to note that, again, other entities like the Natural Resource Conservation Service and universities did fill some of that gap in native plant material development. So there, it didn't ever end, but there was a significant portion of very interesting research that kind of disappeared. All right, so I kind of want to give a step back a little bit and give an idea of what was going on in the big picture in terms of concern while these research programs were going on. I talked about that a little bit with the introduction to the Great Basin and some of the pressures that were ongoing, but I want to frame it a little bit more in a timeline. So starting in the early part of the 20th century, there began to be concern about erosion due to overgrazing. This was seen, especially as populations were increasing, cities and towns forming in the Intermountain West. Water sources were being affected as streams were eroded, and there were significant amounts of impact in riparian zones, up and down elevation of grazing animals. And so that's what drove a lot of the early plant material development, was this concern about grazing, but also for using, so there was the plants that were being used for forage and the plants that were being used as mitigation and restoration. So in the 1930s, we have the Dust Bowl, and while the Great Basin was less affected by the droughts that were occurring in the Great Plains, it did sort of drive this desire to use what worked, right? So, and in the 1930s, there began to be this massive seeding of a non-native species, grass species, and in particular crested wheatgrass for erosion control. And this was done in the Great Plains, and it was immediately transferred also into Great Basin habitats. And so I think some of the first plantings of crested wheatgrass occurred, I believe, in 1935 in the Great Basin. By 1981, there were over 12 million hectares that have been planted in North America in crested wheatgrass, and planting continues. I should note, so this is North America. This includes Canada as well. And a lot of this would have been in the Great Plains. And when I say planting continues, it really continues here in the Great Basin. In the Great Plains, planting is essentially stopped. It's very rare that anybody uses this except for maybe on private lands. And that is because crested wheatgrass is considered invasive in the Great Plains, whereas it's not necessarily considered invasive here. And I should emphasize considered invasive. Whether it is actually invasive is another question. So I keep pressing the wrong button. This is actually some old photos of plantings in Utah. So this is what was done. You know, when you had degraded land, either abandoned farms or land that had been degraded by cattle, people put crested wheatgrass on it. And so this is 1930s, showing that beginning of that process of planting. This is in the Great Basin. This is a cumulative curve of confirmed hectares planted in crested wheatgrass. And you can see it's basically continued to rise over the years. And now we have at least over 2 million hectares that have been confirmed planted in crested wheatgrass. There are lots of, this is only data from the Bureau of Land Management. We don't have, data does not include Forest Service primarily, state lands, or other areas that might have been planted in crested wheatgrass. So in the 1940s, there was actually a surge in concern about wildlife habitat, and particularly upland game, so game birds, mule deer, other types of animals that people like to hunt. And so there was actually a significant amount of research that was focused on restoring wildlife habitat in the Great Basin. And that's actually kind of when a lot of the Forest Service research peaked in terms of native plant material development. And that kind of subsided at the end of the 1950s. And it was very interesting. There was sort of this period where a lot of policy was made, laws were passed, people got really interested in it, and then it kind of faded for a bit. Now, on a national level, that of course picked up in the 60s and 70s, that type of concern. But in the Great Basin, it subsided to some degree. And other concerns started to become more paramount, particularly the growing concern about invasion and fire. And so while wildlife habitat was still an underlying concern, as the amount of fires that were being driven by cheatgrass increased, you have this increasing concern about fires, invasives, and that kind of thing. And so that started to drive a lot of the plant material development. I wanted to throw this in here. This is a kind of a conceptual idea of novel ecosystems. So some people would consider the Great Basin to be, a lot of the areas of the Great Basin to be novel ecosystems because of this conversion to cheatgrass. And the novel ecosystem or concept in restoration ecology is an idea where we kind of accept a certain amount of either accept novel species or novel communities, given certain amounts of altered abiotic and biotic conditions. So some folks would say that we have such an altered state in terms of conditions of the of climate and of plant community structure that we should be thinking about doing things in a different way. And recently, the use of crested wheatgrass, for example, has actually been justified in its use in sort of, okay, we're in an altered state, let's just use it so that we can stop cheatgrass. I have a whole talk that I could go into on that, and I'm not going to, but I just think it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, that this is sort of a newer concern or a newer idea that people are now using to justify the use of a non-native species. So lastly, the present, we have again kind of there's growing concern about habitat loss and the use of introduced species. People start thinking about the genetic appropriateness of seeded species, and it's clear that we're losing plant communities, that we're losing habitat for indicator species like sage grouse. And so starting in the 1990s, you really have an increasing availability of native species, and research overall starts to focus more on native plants and things like seed transfer zones, developing genetically appropriate varieties. So just to kind of summarize all that, that's sort of a long-winded section, but we kind of have in one program everything focused on, in the ARS sort of program, you have range improvement, non-native plant material development, and then moving into both non-native and native plant material development. In the Forest Service research and development side, you get the concern is range recovery, native plant material development, a shift over to the ecology and shrub ecology, and then back into development of seed transfer zones, understanding the genetics of native plants, and full community restoration. So this is a paper that was written by Ledger and Baughman in 2015, and it just shows you kind of what I want to demonstrate, what traits were selected for in plant material development. This includes native species and non-native species. So in this one, and I'm sort of using arrows that show traits in the plants that would be used for the purpose that I'm showing on top of the slide. So in this case, it's range improvement. And as you can see, the arrows are, more arrows being on the top really show that that was something that has been done a lot. Also, agronomic production is a fairly important thing. That's been focused on in a lot of trait selection over the last century. To some degree, competition with cheatgrass, although that has been less of a concern, and not sort of a concern, but there just hasn't been a lot done to specifically select for competition with cheatgrass, although partly that might have to do with the fact that some of the non-native species like crested are fairly good at competing with cheatgrass. And then if you're to look at long-term plant community restoration, there really hasn't been any particular trend towards selecting for that. So the plants that are being used are primarily being have been historically selected for forage production and agronomic seed production. Also conceptually, we have these what are called state and transition models. And this is something that's used in the land management agencies to understand what we might be able to do with degraded areas. And what I want to point out is, so on the bottom left here, you have kind of your, well, I'll go from the top. There's reference state, which is really your area of, this is kind of historical conditions. We do recognize, it's recognized that maybe there's not, it's not possible to get back to some of these historical conditions, but maybe we can get into area, like types of communities that are still diverse, functional, that kind of thing. And then these state and transition models move into invasive annual state, some other conditions, and then you have this seeded range state. And this is a state and transition model that was developed. These are based on expert data and soils and all those kinds of things to try to understand these communities. So there are state and transition models for all sorts of the plant communities throughout the Great Basin. However, this is what I'm about to show you is pretty general across all of these state and transition models. So what's interesting is that when you get into this invasive annual state, it's basically a circle. You have invasive annuals, you can go to seeded range state, maybe you can get some sagebrush in those areas, but the model is actually developed to essentially, the idea is that there isn't a way back necessarily. And even within the seeded range state, you have these circularities. So interestingly enough, we actually have sort of lived in a time where there's a belief that we can't actually move from these seeded range states back into other types of more functional ecological states. Which is really interesting because it turns out that that may have everything to do with the fact that we've been using a certain type of approach to revegetating these areas and not other approaches. With that, I want to talk a little bit about the changing conversation. This is an engram. I forced it a little bit, kind of had to fudge things, but in general, what this shows is what has been of interest, what has been written about over the last several, like I guess almost 150 years about the Great Basin ecosystem. And early on, it's really a lot about range improvement. That is a concern through most of the 20th century. And it only has dropped in concern level in the 21st century. There's been an increasing interest in cheatgrass, whereas habitat restoration and recovery has actually not been a focus of the literature for a significant portion of this time, at least in books. This does not necessarily include journal articles. And then, but there's been an explosion in the last 20 or so years. So just kind of interesting picture. I wouldn't hang my hat on this. I just thought it was sort of an interesting way to view how people are discussing these issues over time. So lastly, I just have a timeline of, I know my time's getting short here, but the timeline of some of the research that's been done since the 1990s when the new range war was declared. With that, it's a lot of it is going to be pretty quick, but I'd like to go through it. So in the 1990s, we have a significant shift in management decisions, and a lot more native species start being used in seed mixes, post-fire seed mixes in the Great Basin. And it's pretty much it's a jump, especially if you look at grasses from non-native use to more use of natives. A big point though, is even though a lot more natives are being used in seed mixes, and that's a good thing, there's still almost no cases where seed mixes do not include a non-native, like crested or Siberian wheatgrass. I was just talking to Anna Halford today, who's the BLM Idaho state botanist, and she estimates that less than 5% of all seedings that the BLM does are native only seedings. So we are still using non-native introduced grasses in these seedings. In 2000, the Great Basin Native Plant Project was formed, and I'm actually the current technical lead of the Great Basin Native Plant Project. It's a partnership between the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service. We also have the Fish and Wildlife Service as a partner more recently. And the Great Basin Native Plant Project basically funds and supports research into native plant material development for use and restoration. In the early 1990s, there started to be significant syntheses of research that have been done. And so, in the early 2000s, and this kind of guided research going forward. And so some of those volumes were produced in GTRs in the early 2000s. Over the course of the last 2 decades, there's been this debates in the literature about genetic appropriateness and whether local genotypes are best. And what's interesting about this is it's moving away from just this non-native native debate and trying to really understand what the most genetically appropriate plant materials would be, whether those are local, whether we understand them through various other ways, climate adaptation or population genetics, that kind of thing. 2014, generalized provisional seed transfer zones were released, and these have started to be used in seed procurement in the Great Basin. A lot of IDIQ contracts that the Bureau of Land Management uses are starting to be used based on these generalized provisional seed zones. These are climate-based. So essentially, the idea here is that we're trying to find areas with similar climate, and because local adaptation is fairly prevalent, if we collect seed within a region and use it within a region of climate, then it's perhaps more likely to succeed. There's also been the development of species-specific seed transfer zones. So, for example, for sagebrush, for blue bunch wheatgrass. Blue bunch wheatgrass is a important keystone species, and throughout a lot of this area, sagebrush, quite obviously, this is the sagebrush steppe, so very important. And with blue bunch, there's some use of these seed zones that's ongoing, and with sagebrush, it's actually the seed zones are being used consistently, even with the large-scale BLM seed buys. So this is in progress, like actually happening. This is a paper that I published with some colleagues, and this is kind of getting at, well, we've been producing native species for a while now. However, they may not be genetically representative of some of the potential genetics that exist out there. This is just showing, this is again for blue bunch wheatgrass. All the releases that are on the market pretty much come from southeastern Washington. And as you might expect, they have a very low, they represent a very low amount of the genetic diversity that exists throughout the blue bunch wheatgrass's range in the Great Basin. So in this graph, you can see there's quite a bit of diversity that exists, and the releases that are on the market represent a very small fraction of that genetic diversity. So just kind of on a philosophical level, I would say that we have, we think about climate change, we think about all these things that are happening, ecological change, fires, cheatgrass, et cetera. I think we have a lot to harness with the genetic diversity that exists in these native species. And if we're only harnessing a fraction of it, we're not giving them a chance in actual like true comparisons, long-term studies, then we really aren't using our resources well. So that's maybe my 2 cents soapbox, if I haven't been soapboxy enough so far. So recently, I also came out with a publication that looked at a long-term study. So in 2000, there was a study that was put in after the railroad fire in the Tintic Valley of Utah, looking at the idea of planting a native-only seed mix versus conventional mixes. And what's interesting about that is, so we published a paper in 2019 where we showed that actually, while the conventional mixes were better, somewhat better at expressing cheatgrass, the native-only mixes did a pretty good job, especially in comparison to the unseeded controls. And then we have a paper that's in revision for applied vegetation science, where we show that the successional trajectories of those plants or those communities that are in those seedings in the native only mixes are actually towards desired conditions, and even towards historical desired conditions, in a sense showing that that state and transition model that I showed earlier, there is actually a pathway out of these states. We just haven't looked for it. And now we look for it, it's there. So whereas the use of these non-native species really does create a novel ecosystem that doesn't go towards states that we might desire for use for wildlife restoration and, say, for example, sage-grouse habitat. Also, there have been some fairly significant studies that have shown that local adaptation is pretty widespread in the Great Basin. In fact, it might actually be an area that has a higher amount of local adaptation than average. This could be due to the amount of topographic variation that we have and climatic variation. So this study on the right here was a study that colleagues and I worked on, and we looked at all of these studies that have been done in common gardens over the last 75 years and found that pretty much all of them showed significant signatures of local adaptation. And then on the left here, this is a paper that came out in 2019 that showed that in a couple of sites that were really long-term sites where sagebrush has been planted, the local sagebrush varieties, so in this case, it's Browns Park at Browns Park and Glens Ferry at Glens Ferry, were the accessions that did the best over time, that had the highest survival. And it's very clear here at Glens Ferry. You see the Glens Ferry variety has almost 100% survival, whereas everything else is almost everything else is below 50%. So this was put in by Idaho Fish and Game, I believe back in the 80s. So quite interesting. All right, that's it. Thank you. And I would love to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Francis. We appreciate it.